Hello and welcome to Mind Shifters Radio. I'm Tim Hayes. I'm your host for the first hour. And today is Monday, August 30th, 2021. As always, we're grateful to everyone who's joining us here today, whether you're listening live or through the archives, as we spend another couple of hours teaching and supporting people in using some of the most powerful, effective, efficient, and accessible tools I've ever encountered. These tools are available absolutely free at whyagain.org. If you go to that page and click on the Start Here logo in the upper left-hand corner, it'll take you to a page where you can download and read Chapter 24 of Dr. Michael Rice's book. His book is titled, Why Is This Happening to Me Again? And that chapter of the book contains a narrative description of the primary tool in this work. There are a host of tools, but the primary tool is called the Reality Management Worksheet, sometimes called the Reality Management Wake-Up Sheet, and it's a tool I've been using to great effect for over 17 years to improve the quality of my life and most of my relationships, and to turn any negative emotional state that I experience into part of the infallible guidance system that each of us has been gifted. You can also download a host of audio files of shows just like this one, where people have been stepped through that process. You can also click a link and download the PDF of the most recent version of that process, absolutely free. Print it off, copy it, use it as often as you'd like. And then if you choose to download and listen to those audio files, they can serve as a tutorial for how to get the best results from applying this tool persistently and consistently in your life. And you can also go to your app store and type in the three words Heartland Aramaic Forgiveness. And before you're done typing the word forgiveness, you'll see the glowing heart icon. And when you click on that link, it'll let you have access to a completely free and private app that contains the Reality Management Worksheet, an abbreviated version of that worksheet process, and a copy of the Dragon Klingon game, which is a wonderful way to introduce these tools to even younger audiences. So we hope you do that soon and often, and then give us a call at 563-999-3581 and press 1. Or alternatively, you can send us an email. You can email me at tjh@mindshifters-academy.org, or you can email Jeannie Rice at jeanie@whyagain.org, whyagain.org. So we have been following through on the commitment to listen to or read the Course in Miracles workbook lessons this year. And today is the 242nd day of the year. And the lesson simply reads, This day is God's day. It is my gift to Him. Commentary says, I will not lead my life alone today. I do not understand the world, and so try to lead my life alone must be but foolishness. But there is one who knows all that is best for me, and He is glad to make no choices for me but the ones that lead to the Creator. I give this day to Him, for I would not delay in my coming home. And it is He who knows the way to the Creator. And so, we give today to you. We come with wholly open minds. We do not ask for anything that we may think we want. Give us what you would have us receive. You know all our desires and all our wants, and you will give us everything we need in helping us to find our way to you. That's the message to the Creator. And Pam Grout, with her Course in Miracles experiment book, titles Lesson 242, Priorities. She quotes Rob Brezenzi as saying, "I will never again cast a curse on myself." Pam writes, "It's time to get out and celebrate. Time to remember how lucky you are. Time to give praise to the highest of holies. As Rob Brezney likes to say, let's break open the forbidden happiness. Sure, I have a to-do list. In fact, I have 2 of them. On mine, the to-do list says, dream up better questions and have the best day of my life. The other to-do list is for Source, God, the field of potentiality. Here's what it says. Handle everything else. So I just focus on dreaming up better questions and how to have the best day of my life, and creation unfolds in a way that handles everything else. As I think about this lesson and I think about the Course in Miracles experiment with Pam Grout today, it reminds me of how so many places in the Way of Mastery it talks about how we don't know what anything is or is for. This is the very, very same message that comes across in Course in Miracles. We don't know what anything is. We don't know what anything is for. There's even an exercise in one of the lessons that says, spend some time, take about 15 minutes out of your day, and just look around and pick up something. Pick up a paperweight, pick up a mug, pick up a book that you have, pick up a clock on your table, and just sit with it and let yourself understand that you do not know where this came from. You do not know who had the first idea for a clock. You don't know where the material came from to construct this clock. If it's plastic, if it's metal, you don't know how many different human beings were responsible for getting this clock from the idea in someone's head into material form and then into your possession. And when we begin to work with that exercise, and we let ourselves sit with the truth that most of what we create as what we know is just made up thoughts, is fantasy, is a construct of thoughts designed to give us some sense of feeling solid and in control. And the truth of our lives is that there's so much more going on around us than we can keep track of, that the path to happiness does not come through the conscious logical mind. We open up a world of possibility, and we open up the possibility to be taught infinitely when we cancel our need to be right and we open ourselves to the recognition that we don't know what anything is or is for. So that's our Course in Miracles workbook lesson for today and the Course in Miracles experiment. And I was thinking about putting on what I would consider as a treat for this listening audience, and that is the interview I did with Robert Whitaker. And it's only about 40 minutes long, so I thought I would do a little intro and then open it up to see if anybody had any quick questions. And when there's about 40 minutes left, run the Robert Whitaker interview. So that's on the record for Mindshifter Radio and can get some more people access to that. That person, who is, I believe, a phenomenal mind, and some of his thoughts from 2 of his 5 books. The first one that I read was Anatomy of an Epidemic, and the next one was Mad in America. And Mad in America traces the history of treating mental health in America from the 1700s until today. And the Anatomy of an Epidemic talks about how clearly there's a problem with all of the medications that are being prescribed for psychiatric and psychological issues and symptoms. And the problem is, if these medications were really as good as they say they are, wouldn't you think that our incidence of people needing to be hospitalized and repeat hospitalizations and eventually filing for mental health disability, wouldn't you think that would be going down over the years if these medications were actually useful in treating these conditions or symptom patterns? Well, that's the conclusion I would have. If something works, then, it's going to reduce the incidence. But the fact of the matter is, the rate of people, the number of people, and the rate at which people are filing for mental health disability has gone up decade after decade since the, quote, discovery of these cures or medications or treatments, whatever you want to call them. And so I have a conversation with Mr. Robert Whitaker, and I will start that in a bit. But first I'll see if anybody has a comment or a question. We've got about 7 minutes before I start that interview. 563-999-3581. If you call that number and press 1, we can have a conversation. What's on your mind? What would you like to highlight as a topic for later in the week, since we're here 5 days a week, 2 hours a day? I'm going to take a chance and turn on the microphone for Susan. Are you available to speak?
Hi, I have my mouth full of a sandwich, but yes. Can you hear me?
Well, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Did you hear that I was going to play this file
right.
for the...
I did. Right.
I appreciate the email you sent me. I think too many cooks spoil the broth is the first thought I have about your speaking engagement. I was very excited that you were going to be doing that solo, because you can do a fabulous job all by yourself. Now that you've expanded it to include Michael and Jeannie, I think that's more than enough. And the other one that you sent me, my response was this lovely prayer keeps hitting the wrong chord for me, because it's such an anthropomorphized view of the Creator. But it's a lovely set of thoughts. I think that the same essence comes out, and it's more flexible when I just say, I don't know. And it's okay that I don't know, because the flow of life and creation is going to keep going, and all kinds of unknown forces have been at play to help me get from, the inception of my soul or body to where I am today, and I don't need to know. So I can sit back and relax, and I don't have to fantasize that there is a larger psychological entity out there, like my great-grandfather, or the male god with the white hair sitting in a cloud directing things, but that life is always going to unfold in ways I could never imagine, and I can just go along for the ride and appreciate it. The way I might
that a lot.
The way I might watch a symphony or a play or a football game, I have no idea how it's going to end. and it's going to be okay.
I'll have to read it again in light of what you said, but I'm sure I'm interested in your take. That's good. Thanks. And as for those speaking things, I talked to Dr. Ryman this morning, and she said, these talks are peer-to-peer users of tools. She wants to get to know you and Michael and Jeannie, but she thought about it, and she said it would really be better if you, as a user of the tools, presented the tool yourself, and we'll get Michael and Tim on it in some other way later on when the intention of the talks is different than what it is. So I'm calling everybody off too. Too many cooks, maybe that's a way of looking at it, but I told her, Michael particularly being the creator of the tool, I mean, you can't really, I would feel a little awkward presenting it when he's right there, and so I figured he would present it, and then I'm thinking, but maybe for this, that's not the right thing. So anyway, I'm composing a letter to all of you to say, hey, the deal's off, I'm on my own here, and maybe later with something else.
Three cheers for Susan. I think that's probably more in the spirit of the person who's creating the program, and that's and it's great because then you're going to do a wonderful job, and then you're going to have more confidence when you go to present in different ways, whether it's individually to people or on programs like that. And and it might be better for this woman because then she can, choose to have Michael on at a later date, and then there's more. People who do that kind of thing are most often looking for good content. Mm-hmm. And it would be better for her to have another source of good content rather than load up all those people on the same show.
Yeah, I agree. That's true. So,
yes?
Yes. Thanks.
You said
so. I think I can do it. Yeah, I would
You'll
like to.
You'll do a fabulous job.
Thank you. I would like to go over the 5-step pattern sheet sometime. If you think, the latest one I sent you is the latest iteration. I had changed a couple of words, and I want to make sure they're all right. So.
Yeah, and I would be happy to do that. I think we should do that just for our own use. I think that's a wonderful refinement on that work, and so let's set a time to do that, and I'll email you about that.
Okay, great.
And for now, I will put you on mute, and I will read an intro, and then start the interview I did with Robert Whitaker. Robert is the author of 4 books and co-author of a 5th. 3 of these books tell of the history of psychiatry. One of them is Anatomy of an Epidemic. The other one is Mad in America. But his Anatomy of an Epidemic won the U.S. Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. And prior to writing books, he worked as a science reporter at the Albany Times-Union newspaper in New York for a number of years. He's also the founder of madinamerica.com. It's a website that features research, news, and blogs by an international group of writers who are interested in rethinking psychiatry. And he was kind enough to let me do an interview, and it is as follows.
Well, so Robert, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
I was hoping you could start us off by telling us how you got into this work and what drives your passion for it.
Sure. Try to keep that story short. So my background, I worked for newspapers for a long time covering science and medicine. And in 1998, I was doing a series for the Boston Globe, really just looking at abuses of patients in psychiatric research settings. And at this time, I had a completely conventional understanding of psychiatry. My understanding was that researchers had discovered that depression and, quote, schizophrenia are caused by chemical imbalances, and we had drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, which, of course, is a story of great progress. And that's what I had written about as a newspaper reporter. But while doing that series, I came upon two studies that belied that notion of progress. One were studies by the World Health Organization, which twice compared outcomes for schizophrenia patients in 3 developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the U.S. and other developed countries. And each time they found that outcomes were much better in the developing countries, specifically India and Nigeria. And I dug into that a little bit because that seemed surprising. The story that we had organized around was a story of great medical advance, and then somehow it wasn't coming out in the outcomes.
Yeah, we've got the miracle cure. How could
Exactly.
they get better results?
I mean, that's what the chemical imbalance story is. It's a story of like a miracle cure. And I can't tell you how many times I called up psychiatrists and they told me, oh, yeah, schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. The drugs block it. It brings it back into balance. That's what I was told regularly. Anyway, in the second study, the World Health Organization investigators hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is they're more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics regularly. They adhere to that treatment. Now, that's a valid hypothesis because if medications are so essential, which certainly we believe in this country related to schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, then adherence should lead to better outcomes. But what they found was that in the developing countries with the best outcomes, they used the drugs acutely but not chronically. They only maintained about 11% of their patients regularly on the medications. Now, this sort of blew my mind because literally in this series, by the way, which I was rewarded for for the Boston Globe, one of the frameworks was you should never take away antipsychotics from schizophrenic people because it's like insulin for diabetes. But this made me wonder, have I got something wrong here? And then I found a study by Harvard researchers that looked at evolving schizophrenia outcomes over the past century. Now, again, part of the narrative of the progress is that in 1955 we get thorazine, chlorpromazine. It's introduced into asylum medicine, and that makes this great advance forward. And you can even read histories of psychiatry where they compare the introduction of thorazine as similar in importance as the introduction of antibiotics in infectious medicine. And that's telling you of a great advance. But what did the Harvard researchers find? They found that schizophrenia outcomes, in fact, were in decline in the United States, and they were now no better, and in other developing countries, and they were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century, long before the arrival of the antipsychotics. So both of these studies belied what I knew to be true. And that led me to get a contract to write a book called Mad in America. And basically, the purpose of this book was to investigate why are outcomes for, quote, the mad, or people with schizophrenia, so poor in the United States. And what I found in the course of that investigation is we have this narrative of progress around antipsychotics and psychiatric drugs, that they fix chemical imbalances. But you find that that's not true. You find that it was a hypothesis born of understanding of how drugs acted on the brain, and then they hypothesized the drugs had the opposite effect. But they actually never found that a lesion in the dopamine sections of the brain is a primary cause of schizophrenia. Then you take that same, look through the scientific literature with antidepressants, and you find the same story. Antidepressants are said to depression is said to be caused by low serotonin. The drugs up serotonin. They fix it like insulin for diabetes. Well, what you find in the scientific literature is that hypothesis was born in the 1960s based on what the first antidepressants did. They investigated it in the 70s and 80s, and as early as 1984, the NIMH was saying, we're just not finding a lesion in the serotonin system. In 1998, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said, this hypothesis hasn't panned out. And frankly, it wasn't a very smart hypothesis because there's no reason that the pathology of a disorder should be the opposite of some drug that treats symptoms.
Right.
So literally what happened was, I thought, as I investigated this, we, American society and other developed societies, are organizing their thinking and their care around a false narrative with the chemical imbalance narrative at the core of that. And then once you start digging into the narrative, the second part that you find over and over again is that while psychiatric medications, say antipsychotics or antidepressants, may provide some benefit over placebo in knocking down symptoms over the short term, you see in both lines of research on schizophrenia and depression that worries develop pretty early on that the use of these medications is actually increasing the chronicity of these disorders, the relapse rates, and functional impairments over the long term. And once I began, and I really explored that in the book you mentioned, Anatomy of an Epidemic, and think about this. Mental health and thinking about ourselves is such a critical part of our lives and a critical part of how a society responds to problems, how it treats its kids, how you think of yourself. And writ large, what I found, and I had been a science and medical reporter for a long time, and for example, I was the director of communications at Harvard Medical School for a long time. Not a long time, but for a period of time. So I had a very solid sort of scientific training. And we have a situation here where we as a society have organized ourselves around what I call a false narrative of science, and it is doing great harm. You can see the harm in the rising burden of mental illness among our kids, among our adults. We have early death problems, more people on disability. So that's the reason I got into this, and that's the reason for my passion, because I think this storytelling of a false narrative has had a great impact on our lives and a negative impact. And to have good science and good treatment, you have to organize your thinking around whatever science is telling you and what people with lived experience are telling you too. They need to be heard from as well.
Well, and that's one of the things that struck me in your book when you were talking about how our societal narrative has really been the driving force for what we tolerate and allow. And as you are talking about treating the, quote, mad, the people who are mad, from the 1700s forward, as the narrative changes, the money that's available for the treatment facilities, the nature of treatment facilities that are made available is changing as well. And, you know, I was shocked by the information you have about eugenics and how powerful that was here in the United States before that misguided concept was adopted by the Germans and the concentration camps. But it's the same thing. We had abandoned people who had mental health issues and chosen to view them as a burden on society or on high society, and then the money dried up. And
they literally would call people with, you know, in mental hospitals, psychiatric disorders, or just sometimes just odd people who were put in hospitals, a burden on the population.
Exactly.
And those were the words they used. And really what, under the eugenics ideas that took hold around the turn of the century, around 1900, well, of course, we got forced sterilization, but we also got the sense they need to be segregated in mental hospitals so they don't spread their bad genes. So what you see is discharge rates for first episode, quote, psychotic patients prior to the eugenics era weren't bad. Like you'd see 65, 70% being discharged. But once you get eugenic ideas, the idea is to keep them there at least through the breeding years. And discharge rates go down, and we start saying, oh, this is why these disorders are chronic. But that actually was the policy. And by the way, we, as you say, we were the first country to adopt eugenic ideas into legislative, policies. From 1945 to 55, after eugenics became a discredited, idea, look at discharge rates in America's mental hospitals for that decade. After you really this idea we should segregate them. Discharge rates for first episode psychotics are 65-70%. We forget that because the part of the narrative is they couldn't come out until the antipsychotics arrived in 1955. That's just not true. Discharge rates for first episode patients were already 65-70% before the antipsychotics.
And it's clear, your work and others have pointed out, that when you put people on medications, it dramatically increases the probability that they'll have numerous relapses or be chronic or need to be on those medications forever, because they create physiological change patterns in the brain as the brain is trying to reach its homeostasis. And what most of the studies that talk about withdrawal or taking people off medication, they just drop them off cold turkey or very quickly, and then they get a rebound effect and say, well, look, that means they need to be on this to prevent psychosis. Whereas people like Dr. Bregan and others point out, that's ridiculous. If you come off slowly, if you come off with the aid of some other things, if you haven't been on it too long, you don't have the chronic relapse and rebound and psychotic episodes.
There's two things on this. I mean, this actually shows up shortly after the introduction of antipsychotics in the 1950s. All of a sudden, clinicians who had been used to discharge rates and people staying well rates, they noticed people were coming back more frequently now. And they called this the revolving door syndrome. Well, that was a new description of what was happening with the use of antipsychotics. And there was even a study done in Boston that showed relapse rates were higher, that sort of thing. And my frustration is what you just said. So by the way, there's never been a good placebo-controlled trial of the efficacy of antipsychotics in medication-naive patients? Never. We've never studied that. But what we hear in society is, people come off the antipsychotics, they relapse, as if that's the return of the disease.
Yes.
But really you see in these studies, they take chronic patients. By chronic patients, I mean people who've been on these drugs for some time, often 5, 10 years, and then they withdraw everybody abruptly, and then they immediately randomize half back to the drug that they're used to, and the other they keep off. And of course, those who are now going through withdrawal, they relapse. We know that. But it's not the return of the disease. It's a medication withdrawal effect for the very reason you said. Their brains have been changed by being on the drug. And the frustration is everybody knows this. It's a charade to keep on doing this.
Well, and you talk about compassionate care and the Quakers. And, of course, a lot of people might be tempted to just toss that off. It was so long ago and there was no way to really study it. But then you talk about Mosher and soteria. Can you tell us a little bit about that study and what that...
Yeah, and by the way, soteria is really coming back now. And Israel is really beginning to embrace this approach to treating psychosis. So under the Quakers, and they start doing this in the late 1796, I think they opened their first retreat in York, England. And the Quakers had this thought. At the time, there were all these madhouses in the UK where the people thrown in there were chained up and mistreated, that sort of thing. The Quakers said this: we don't know what causes madness, but we do know this: they're brethren. They're not the other. They're brethren. And as brethren and as children of God, they have a natural capacity to recover their sanity. That's a possibility, okay? And if not, we have a moral obligation to provide a good shelter, good food, and a kind environment. So they open their York retreat, and if you can read descriptions of it, of course, they're not using medical treatments. They want to create a new environment. They think nature is healing. They think kindness is healing.
And they're not using medical doctors.
What's that?
They're not using medical doctors.
No, they're not using. It's not a medical approach. That's part of the thing. They don't want the mad doctors in there. And what you find, and they actually kept quite good records, you found, especially with the first episode people, the people nearly coming, the overwhelming majority got better with time. And there was exercise, good food. Yeah. So the Quakers' treatment involved exercise, good food, walks in nature. The idea is they would dine together. They'd have a glass of art. They do art. They might even, and they would, write. they'd read, they'd have a glass of porter in the afternoon, and they kept good records. And what you find was with first episode people who hadn't been long time in madhouses or something, the overwhelming percentage got better, okay, and discharged and didn't come back. Now that sort of so-called moral therapy then was, adopted by Quakers in the United States. Some of the first asylums, like McLean Hospital, was initially a moral therapy asylum. There was ones in Philadelphia, Hartford, et cetera. And they reported good results with first episode patients. The best long-term study came out of Worcester Asylum. And with first episode patients, something like 65% were discharged and never came back within the course of 30 years. Now, that's much better outcomes than we get to today. And by the way, if you look at their historians who've gone back and look at their case descriptions, these people were seriously disturbed going into the hospitals that time. Anyway, we could talk about what happened, but that gets eventually discredited. And the reason it gets discredited is because we build these big asylums and communities, public asylums, and they start putting people with Alzheimer's in there, in-stage syphilis, and the discharge rates go down. And then eugenics comes along. Anyway, in the 1970s, Loren Mosher, who was then head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH, said to himself, we're not getting good results with our new form of care. People are revolving, going back into the hospitals. Let's try and see if environmental care can produce better outcomes. And so he set up an experiment where mostly newly diagnosed people with psychosis would either be treated, randomized to the hospital, or randomized to a home in the San Francisco area where others would just be with them. They'd cook together, they'd socialize together. There was no intention really on knocking out the crazy ideas. The idea was in these environments, people who might be very afraid of others would learn to be with others, learn to cook, and that this would help with that environment, without doctors, by the way, that was part of Loren's idea, the psychosis would begin to abate.
The psychosis would begin to abate.
Right. So in the study, those treated with Soteria, they had the same diminishment of psychotic symptoms over the short term than those treated conventionally in the hospital, okay? That was the 6. And in terms of use of antipsychotics, it went like this. They tried not to give it immediately, because one of the ideas was people, in order to get through this crisis and respond to this crisis, they need to be able to mount emotional responses. That's part of a resilience and a healing process. And the drugs, of course, very much block emotional responses.
Right.
So this is one of the purposes of it. Now, if people weren't getting better after like a few weeks or 3 weeks, they might give them a low dose of an antipsychotic, and then after a time they'd see who could come off. And I think at the end of 2 years, something like 40% had never been exposed to antipsychotics. Maybe another 40% had temporarily, and around 20% or something were on the drugs long term. And here's the thing. And this experiment ran for 10 years, 2 houses, was replicated. Their outcomes were better at the end of 2 years. They were more likely to be working, in school, and out of the hospital. So that was an experiment in modern times where a different approach, an environmental approach, an approach that didn't focus on just knocking down symptoms but really helped people get well, proved to be successful.
And
what
again,
happened?
And again, it was run by people who weren't physicians.
Yes, they did.
So that created a very threatening situation for the physicians who were supposed to be the experts.
Exactly. Now, Loren, of course, was a physician. He was educated at Harvard Medical School. But it earned him enemies for just precisely this reason. Because in essence, he said, we can shift the treatment of, psychotic patients out of the hospital, which is a medical environment, and we don't need doctors. We just need people who can be with others in this time of extreme states. And, of course, what happened is he was forced out of the NIMH for that very reason, because it was such a threat. Now, the interesting thing is there were 2 other studies done at the same time by the NIMH that both found better outcomes for psychotic patients not treated with medications over a longer period of time, both of them. And one of the leaders even said, we have to start, a psychiatrist named William Carpenter said, we have to worry that these drugs, in fact, are making people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis. That's 1980. again, and there was actually some research done by out of Canada that came forth with a biological explanation of why that was so, and they said, yes, many patients are developing what we call tardive psychosis, a permanent psychosis, and it was related to the brain's compensatory reaction to the drugs. But then this went against money, it went against the medical personnel, and it gets pushed away. Now, just what's frustrating, then we'll go up to what's happening with soteria. The best long-term outcome study that has been done in the modern time is done by Thomas Job and Martin Harrell at the University of Illinois. Starting in the late 70s, early 80s, they recruit 200 it's mostly young patients, either first or second episode from 2 hospitals, one private, one public. Everyone's treated conventionally in the hospital with drugs. Then they're discharged, and Harrell and Job it's a naturalistic study. They're just going to follow them up at 2, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, and 20 years. At each follow-up, they're going to look at, are they symptomatic? Are they working? Are they socializing? And are they using medications? Now, the hypothesis was that those who choose to stop taking their medications will do real poorly. Well, they found exactly the opposite, and they've now published 7 or 8 papers. They found that the long-term recovery rates for those who took themselves off medication was 6 times higher than for those who were medication compliant and stayed on the drugs. And by the way, they also found this. By year 2, a number of people diagnosed with schizophrenia had taken themselves off medication, but they were still psychotic, as were the people on the drugs, by the way. What did they see over the next 2.5 years? So this is a longer course than what you see in a 6-week trial. They saw that they became stable. By the end of 4.5 years, something only like 10% were actively psychotic. But here's the interesting thing is, these people that stopped taking drugs left care. What Harrell and Job did is they had the brilliance to follow them into the community and find out how they were doing. And by the way, those who got stable off med, almost no one relapsed over the rest of that study. So that completely belies the idea that the medications reduce the risk of relapse. And by the way, they published 6-7 articles on this. They've looked at this data from every possible angle, and now there's been other studies from other countries that in essence have replicated the sense that on the whole, recovery rates are higher for unmedicated patients. And then finally, you have a form of care out of northern Finland where they tried to be very environmentally focused. It's called open dialogue. And and they started this in 1990. What were their outcomes? At the end of 5 years, 80% of their patients, first episode patients, are working or back in school and asymptomatic and off antipsychotics. That was the results from their first 5-year study.
80%.
80%. Now that seems so high, but I just want to say, in the decade before the arrival of antipsychotics, you would see cohort studies that said, at the end of 3 to 5 years, anywhere from 65 to 80% would be living in the community, and there was no social service. In other words, they had to be working and that sort of thing. So it's sort of a reflection of some of the outcomes we were seeing before the arrival of antipsychotics. And finally, going back to soteria, there is a revival of this approach in a little bit in the United States, but particularly in Israel. They have a number of soteria houses opening up with the idea of being with people, and they seem to be flourishing.
I was flipping through here as you were wrapping up there, your epilogue, which is looking at some lessons that can be learned from, the masterful presentation you've done of the data, of the history. And one of the things that is so critical that you've mentioned a couple times here is actually talking to the people who receive the services as though they're human beings and they've got an experience that's valid and that the feedback from that experience might inform care. Well, if you're into that model of eugenics and you're thinking these are inferior beings to begin with, then there's no reason to ask them how they liked it or if they felt it was good. But when you look at people who've been in psychiatric hospital care in the allopathic model, which is medicate, 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 and restrain, 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 and ask them how they liked it, you get a very different picture from the people who were in the Quaker houses or in the Soteria houses.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I think, such an important point. In medicine, we do know that as a general rule, you need to listen to your patients and listen from them and learn from them. But in psychiatry, precisely because so often the patients didn't like these aggressive medical treatments, which really had the purpose of silencing them and quieting them, they often rejected treatments, including antipsychotics. In fact, it was the introduction of antipsychotics that really helped create a psychiatric survivor movement in the 1970s. So how did psychiatry respond to people being released saying, we hate these drugs? They make us feel like zombies. We can't have real lives. They said, these people lack insight into their illness and they don't know they're sick. So they adopted as a primary sort of mode of care, not listening to their patients.
Exactly.
And that's just a prescription for bad outcomes and bad medicine. And I just want to add one thing to what you just said here is, how do we conceive of people who are having this, let's say a psychotic episode, a manic episode, or any of these sort of extreme states? Are they like us or are they the other? Are they abnormal or are they just in the spectrum of what human beings are? And in alternatives, starting with the Quakers, there's no effort to say, here's the abnormal people and here's the normal people. It's like, hey, human beings are, our minds are a difficult place. They go to crazy places and we don't really know why these things happen, but they are brethren. And if you start with that, you get a whole different form of care as opposed to they're the other, we need to be afraid of them, they're violent and all this sort of thing. So this conception is so critical, I think, to everything that follows.
So what's you say at the top of the wish list for things that could be different, honesty is at the top of that list, right? The idea that, can we actually get the drug companies and or the physicians that are prescribing these things to be honest with people about what they can expect and what they really know and don't know.
Right.
As you know, it is an extraordinarily complex web of things at this point in time. The Zyprexa papers, the billions of dollars that are at stake that are funneled into marketing directly to the doctors, or the kind of I don't know what kind of negative words I should use. The idea of the abuse, in my personal opinion, the abuse of letting drug companies market directly to patients. Ask your doctor.
Right.
And what's your doctor going to tell you? Because your doctor has been trained in the system that was funded by the drug companies to begin with.
Right.
So what can you tell us about the movements that are going? I know you're somewhat connected to people and you have some connections. The person that introduced me to you who works with, like the Survivor Network or, consumer advocacy. What is your awareness of how it's moving? You say it is changing, and the Soteria is coming back in, did you say in Israel and in the U.S.?
Israel, and there's some Soteria houses in the U.S. popping up. And the open dialogue therapy that was promoted in northern Finland is becoming quite popular in countries. And there's something called the Hearing Voices Network that's really growing here and elsewhere. Here's what's happening. That old narrative really has collapsed, even among those within that narrative. So it's openly admitted now the chemical imbalance theory did not pan out. That's number one, within the biological psychiatry community. Two, for a long time we heard that these are discrete illnesses of the brain, they're biological disorders. And therefore depression is a discrete illness, ADHD is a discrete illness, schizophrenia, etc. Well, what you see among experts in diagnosis, they're saying these are constructs, folks. We really haven't validated any of these as real disorders. And for example, Stephen Hyman, talking about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, said it's a book of horrors or something to that effect. And then, an Anatomy of an Epidemic did help us. There is increasing look at the long-term outcomes, and no one has been able to say that they're good. So that whole story of medical progress has actually, within the scientific community, collapsed. Now, when you have one narrative collapse, it opens up the possibility for a paradigm shift, a rethinking, and I think that's where we're at. And here's two examples of how this is bubbling up. The UN Special Rapporteur for Health, Danius Purus, he recently left. He wrote a paper when he was done calling for a revolution in mental health. And he said we need to pay attention to social factors, poverty, inequality, poor housing, poor diet, and we need to put much less emphasis on drugs, which haven't led us to the promised land. We need to rethink this whole thing. Now, when he put that out, he got a lot of pushback, but nevertheless, this was coming from someone, the UN Special Rapporteur for Health, calling for revolution. Now, I will tell you, I run something called Mad in America, a website. We even had people from our staff that were contributing to his sort of drafts because he really appreciated, I think, how we were both deconstructing the existing science and pointing to other possibilities. Second, just last week, the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization put out a big study, a big analysis document calling for a paradigm shift, as well a paradigm shift in mental health, along the same lines. They even quoted Danius Purus, and they said, we got to have more soterias, we got to have less emphasis on meds, we need to consider social factors, we need to have human rights factors, we got to stop forcing people into treatment and locking them up. So here you have two big bodies saying what's been working, what's been told to us isn't really true. It's not working, and we need something different. So that is really opening up possibilities like soteria is even sort of being embraced by the Ministry of Health. Now, how about in Norway? Norway, the Minister of Health, ordered all of its 4 health districts, it has a national health service, but there's sort of 4 providers, to start providing medication-free treatment to psychiatric patients for those who want it. There's a hospital that opened up near Oslo that calls itself the first medication-free hospital for psychiatric patients. Now, actually, it's a place where people who usually go who've been in the care now want to get off the meds. But my point is, I think we're at an inflection point, where a moment where we say, okay, what we've been doing for the past 40 years in particular has failed. Disability rates, by the way, have risen in every developed country. Our kids hit age 18 now, and it's like 25% have a diagnosis. Anyway, and we also know that whole story was a corrupt story fueled by pharma money and frankly, some guild interests. So we're at a moment now we can re-envision what we do. And I think that's happening. A lot of it is bubbling up from grassroots. But it's really getting traction. It really is. The Hearing Voices networks are spreading. The Open Dialogue networks are spreading. Soteria-type houses are spreading. And you are seeing from the top, like the World Health Organization, like the UN Special Rapporteur for saying, like, listen, environments matter. Environments matter. So if you have bad environments and you have traumatic environments, you're going to have people suffer and struggle, and we need to bring that into our thinking. And if environments matter in causing problems, better environments can also be pathways to recovery as well. So honestly, I think there are a lot of guild interests, there are a lot of financial interests that don't want to hear any of this. But there is a growing movement for wholesale change. And by the way, the public isn't happy with that sort of medication, that disease model of care either. They want something different. And they want it different for their children too, because that's been a disaster. So that's where I think we're at. I think we're at for a possible rethinking, a reconceptualization, away from this disease model, away from the medical model to what the World Health Organization said. We need a human rights model, and part of human rights is, right to shelter, right to food, and that sort of thing.
Well, and the other word you slipped in there, traumatic environments, trauma, recognizing if you're looking for, most of us in the Western culture want a simple cause and effect relationship. And where as human beings, the mind, the emotions, the connection energetically to the body is not just that simple. There's a lot of different factors in there. But more and more people are recognizing, whether they're trained in integrative medicine or functional medicine or holistic approaches, trauma is one of those really strong complicating factors. And addressing the traumas and the resolution of the effects of past traumas is one of the best ways to get improved outcomes.
Right. If you think of a trauma, and by the way, when I was writing Anatomy of an Epidemic, I think I interviewed somewhere between 80 to 100 people. Just asked them their stories. And especially those who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar, so many of them told of difficult childhoods. I mean, it's just true. They talk about being bullied and not being safe at the home, that sort of thing. So they weren't, as youth, in places that felt safe. They weren't afraid. So there was a stress and isolation even as children. And so I think if we start thinking of this, one of the solutions, in my opinion, to trauma, beyond whatever sort of therapeutic things in terms of addressing that, et cetera, is how can you create non-traumatic environments today for people?
Right.
Where they can be with others, they can socialize with others, they can find meaning, they can find love. So that conception leads to a whole different understanding of what is possible.
Well, and what you're talking about there is so beautifully represented in Gabor Mate's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and the harm reduction movement is getting at exactly what you're talking about. Maybe we can't go back and undo all the traumas, but we can help create environments in the present moment that leave people feeling safe and connected and a part of community and having a sense of worth and
meaning in life, right? We all need meaning in life. I mean, we need everything you just said, having a sense of warmth and worth and that sort of thing. But think about how different that is from a disease model that says to people, you're abnormal, and you're going to be abnormal, you have an abnormal brain, and you're going to be abnormal for the rest of your life. Good luck, take the drug. Now, which story, let's say you're struggling, depression, mania, whatever it may be. Which narrative do you want to be greeted with? Which one do you want to try to inhabit as you go forward with your life?
the one that's got some hope.
Exactly. I mean, it's so simple in a way. I mean, we all know that hope is central to, recovery from a lot of medical disorders, to be honest with you, a lot of disorders.
Yeah, and it is, to me, it's very heartening to continue to interview people like you and then other practitioners who are willing to go the extra mile and get trained in functional medicine after they get their regular medical degree or in integrative approaches. And the hope is that we'll get people as consumers that say, I don't want to go to somebody who isn't willing to work with me and ask me how I like what we're doing. Right? If I'm going to go to somebody who's going to view me as defective and lesser than them, and somebody who can't make decisions about his or her own life, then I'm going to get a whole different outcome than if I find somebody who's willing to work with me.
Yeah, I think there is a rising tide of that approach among people who, come as patients or come seeking help, that they want to have agency, they want to be listened to. If you talk to people who are frustrated or have done poorly with the current disease model, medical model, one of the things they always talk about is they didn't care about me. They didn't listen to me. They never even asked me what my problem was.
Or if they ask you, do you want this medication, and then you say no, then they go and get a court order to be able to force it on you anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But I think as part of this change, there is a groundswell among ordinary folks for something different.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that your books, both of them, have contributed to that. I greatly appreciate your willingness to take the time to talk to us here today. Is there something that we haven't even touched on yet that you'd want to put in here before we wrap up?
Well, I guess real quickly, I do run this website called madinamerica.com that is devoted to sort of rethinking psychiatry. And one of the things that we do is we try to feature stories of people with lived experience. We cover the science, we have resources, et cetera, but we regularly, every week, we have a story from someone with lived experience. The point is to bring that into the societal discussion. So I'd say to your listeners, if you have experiences that you'd like to just, if you
share,
to make your story known, write us, and we're looking for stories of people with lived experience. It's always been an essential, almost central part of what we do.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I appreciate your time more than you'll know, and I look forward to the next book you might happen to write.
Okay, if I can just find some time. Anyway, thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.